Dear conference participants from all over the world, what brings us here together today with participants from over 60 countries, from 4 continents, is our utmost distress that the very existence of humanity is in grave danger. The aim of our conference is to arouse the awareness of ever larger social forces around the world that because of the danger of the presently escalating strategic confrontation, there could be soon a full military engagement between NATO and Russia, leading to a world war, which in all likelihood would mean the annihilation of mankind in a following nuclear winter. The aim of our conference is therefore to demonstrate in the most powerful way that there exists an immediately accessible alternative, a paradigm which can leave that mortal threat behind us and begin a new era of human history in cohesion with the true nature of mankind as the only species known so far capable of reason. That danger of a large war did not start on February 24th of this year. As my late husband LaRouche forecasted with prescience in August 1971, after Nixon replaced the fixed exchange rates of the Bretton Woods system with floating exchange rates, that a continuation of this monetarist policy, unless corrected, would lead inevitably to a new fascism and a new world war. And that is 50 years later, exactly where we are right now.
I don't consider that I waste my time on Saturday. It's a great pleasure for me to be with my friends, with the new faces whom I don't know. And I would like to confirm my thanks to Schiller Institute and Helga Zepp-LaRouche for this opportunity to share my view on a very important and pressing issue that we have discussed today. It's very interesting to listen participants from 4 continents. I see one denominator that everybody is concerned by current situation. Nobody is satisfied what is going on, and we see so many problems we can solve. And it's very important that today I come to conclusion that nobody outside can give us any solution. Neither United States nor Russia. You see that we are just a member of international community, and it's very important for us to sit together and to discuss all outstanding issues. But I would like to confirm an importance for NGO to be involved in this process. I'm sure that without your assistance, it will be very difficult to find a compromise which fits everybody. So again, I would like to confirm my readiness to participate in any of your events, and it will be a great honor for me to welcome you in our embassy if and when you find an opportunity to come to Washington.
I think we should see this as a beginning of a new process and not just one event. I am convinced that war must stop. Destroying properties, killing of people is not the answer. We must get at the table to solve the problem, to save lives, and bring peace to the area, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. I believe the key is to focus on redesigning the world. It is not a piece of conversation. We got to get it done. And it has to move away from power and profit to planet and people. Environmental blunders get less attention today than we need. We also need to get off this command and control architecture. take advantage of hyperconnectivity and begin new conversation with focus on collaboration, cooperation, co-creation. There is enough for everybody in this world. Why do we need to fight? Can we take humanity to the next level by focusing on hyperconnectivity to create new order? And that's what I would like to see.
I present to you today an African citizen's perspective. Alongside most African citizens, I am deeply concerned about the human suffering in Ukraine and call for the war to end, for Russia to withdraw its armed forces, and for the humanitarian crisis to be urgently addressed. I urge that NATO and Russia sit around a negotiation table and that a lasting peace settlement to be reached that embraces a new, secure, and envisioned peace between Eastern and Western Europe. The world does not need another world war or even the doomsday scenario of a nuclear winter. The UN Charter commits all of us to find a peaceful means to settle our differences and ensure that sovereignty and integrity of all states needs to be upheld. I have played a role as a freedom fighter against apartheid. I've been a member of President Nelson Mandela's cabinet. I reiterate that the only way we can rise above our differences and our constituencies and find common ground is through peaceful negotiations. Africa has no intention of becoming again the theater of proxy wars in geopolitical conflicts between global powers. As our president, Nelson Mandela, wisely said, it always seems impossible until it's done. I pray and hope, along the majority of African citizens, that we find the political will today to find that piece of Mandela within ourselves, to manifest a greater humanity that we are capable of achieving. I thank you.
It is my pleasure to attend this international conference hosted by International Schiller Institute. The world today is undergoing major changes and great pandemic both unseen in the scenery. With intense and complicated major power rivalry and escalated regional hotspots issues, the world has entered a period of new turbulence and transformation, and the international order is facing severe challenges. Against this backdrop, it is of great significance for President Helga and the Schiller Institute to initiate this conference. I believe today's conference will be very productive and successful to review international situation and explore ideas to build together a better world for all. China supports Europe to play a leading role and supports Europe, Russia, the US, and NATO to hold dialogue, facing up to the tensions that have piled up over the years and found solutions so as to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security framework in Europe. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a responsible major country, China will continue to make its voice heard, put forward initiatives, and take actions to stop war and promote peace and earnestly safeguard regional and world peace and stability.
Right now, the world is suffering from a bad lack of democracy, trust, and increasing confusion. Citizens no longer recognize themselves in political institutions, and there is no longer trust between states themselves. In an increasingly connected world, we witness increasingly fragmented societies and the erosion of democracy in the West. As an Italian, I experienced the nightmare of being subjected to political choices that I believe are detrimental to the security of my country and the achievement of the peace we all desire. I have witnessed appeals for peace addressed to Russia by her political leaders while they were at the same time sending weapons to Ukraine. Even among the humanitarian aid and the airport of Pisa, they have discovered clandestine weapons and the airport trade unions refused to load them on the planes. Invoking peace while at the same time sending weapons is like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. I welcomed with great enthusiasm the call of the Schiller Institute to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations, inspired by the Peace of Westphalia.
The problems are great indeed. I'm reminded of what Ramsey Clark once said about what made Lyndon LaRouche so dangerous to his enemies in the international financial establishment is that his organization was a fertile engine of ideas. And it is again today exactly that which makes us so much of a threat to the existing financial establishment centered in London with an important branch in Wall Street. And it is now urgent that we rev up those engines to deal with a crisis of a magnitude that we haven't seen since the 14th century Black Death, if then. We're looking down the barrel of the gun of world famine, for example, which, whereas just a few months ago, the estimates were 235, 250 million people would be dying of starvation over the course of this year. Now the best estimates, and they are unfortunately accurate, are that as many as 1 billion people could well die of famine this year. That's 1/8 of the human population. If you want to be rich, build roads first. Not rich in money. If you want to be rich in money, go into the drug trade, go into speculation, become a Wall Street banker. If you want to have a nation have actual richness, you have to build infrastructure because that's what develops the productive powers of labor and the potential relative population density as the actual measure of economy that has to replace gross domestic product. This is what Lyndon LaRouche had always proposed, a 4-power agreement of Russia, India, China, and the United States, where around proposals such as the Belt and Road Initiative of China, the offer is made to the United States and to Europe to join that activity, which of course will benefit not Wall Street, not the City of London, but it will benefit the population and the industry of that entire region. It's not such a huge change for the United States. It means only going back to the principles of Alexander Hamilton on which our American system of political economy was in fact founded.
So like other major countries in the world, China should make a contribution to the development of the world, to the development of other countries, like the advanced country, the US, the European country, Japan, they all do the same. And then certainly there's one way for China to make the contribution through the existing global development cooperation architectures. Even with the generous support from the advanced country, most developing countries in Latin America, in South Asia, in Africa, were trapped in low income or middle income status. They did not improve much. And so if China joined the existing architecture by increasing more money support to that, the result is very likely to be similar. And why the advanced country generously provides so much money, but we cannot get the result of development, of reducing poverty, elimination hungers. But how to deliver the decent job to the people? You need to have industrialization, you need to have technological innovation, but to make industrialization possible, technological innovation, adopting the modern technology possible, you need to have the infrastructure. That's the goal 9 of the SDG. And the Belt and Road Initiative will contribute to the improvement of the infrastructure, so allow the country to have modernization, industrialization, and that will bring the decent job to the people. And with the decent job, as I said, then they will have no hunger, no poverty, good health.
Biden has put the full faith and credit of the United States in serious doubt. In order for Biden to exert maximum impact on Russia, the U.S. needs most, if not everybody, in the world to join the sanction and stop doing business with Russia. So far, other than U.S., Canada, and the EU countries, not even Mexico, by the way, none of 53 African countries have joined the sanction. None of the 33 Latin American countries have. None of 22 Middle East countries have. Only three of the 48 countries in Asia, namely Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. China is the leading trading partner for over 120 countries, virtually the entire world. China has become the factory of the world and makes products that everybody needs and wants to buy, and that includes the United States. So China is not going to be intimidated by the threat of sanction. If Biden were to insist on economic sanctions on China, the blowback will hurt the American consumer. Made in America factories to replace China's factories will take a very long time. In the meantime, American consumers will face inflation and scarcity. It's becoming increasingly apparent that the U.S. speaks loudly but carries a shriveled stick.
We should speak of a new world order, and we should consider whether or not human beings are going to continue to be at the center of events, and whether or not human beings are the most important thing for those centers of thought, such as the centers of power, where we see that the harm done to human dignity and to life itself has reached a serious and enormous crossroads, such that it could easily be replaced by artificial intelligence. It's no longer a matter of the thinkers of some economic theoreticians, where man uses man, where man is enslaved, and then he is freed and goes on to the concept of the proletariat, and evolves to the concept of the new world of labor. So we all have to ask ourselves the question, are human beings really at this time at the center of the thinking of those think tanks and centers of power? We think that they should be.
Aeschylus, the Greek tragedian, the master of Greek tragedy, 400 BC or so, he was also a warrior. In those days, people had these various definitions. And he said something. He said, when war breaks out, the first casualty is the truth. Now, at the moment, we are having, with this, the media, what happens? I quoted Aeschylus. When war breaks out, so the Americans have been, Trump asked Carter, sir, the Chinese are going ahead. What should we do? Carter turned back and said, look, since 1979, the Chinese have not been at war. They had that war with Vietnam, if you remember, and I covered that war. Now, after that, we, said Carter, have never stopped being at war. And our media, therefore, has never stopped being a war media. And therefore, one of the great tragedies of our time is the singular collapse of the credibility of the Western media. Yes, we watched the tragedy of Bucha with misty eyes. Yes, we watch what is going on in Ukraine. But the question remains at the back of our mind. Is this the whole truth? It is unlike My Lai. When Walter Cronkite went and exposed the whole thing, and it changed the trend of the Vietnam War. Today, there is doubt on Bucha. There are those who want to believe it. There are those who want to suspect what is being reported. There is this division. And what is in the bargain is the new global order. Where is the media in all of this? We have to think very deeply on that one.
As you can see here, it's important to implement the approach of development corridors in order to ensure the flow of the necessary inputs so that both the imports as well as the exports of food can be carried out through these development corridors that are proposed as part of the new Silk Road. That, we believe, is what must be done at this moment, at this punctum saliens that we are facing in history.
Y tenemos dos caminos. Uno, avanzar hacia una nueva era, un renacimiento.
We have two paths available. One to advance towards a new era, a renaissance of economic growth and of dialogue of cultures, or what some theoreticians of the clash of civilizations are proposing, a dark age of perpetual wars and conflicts among nations. We in Colombia have the hope that the entire planet and these forums of dialogue deepen the necessary advance of a dialogue of cultures and economic cooperation which the planet so needs. Thank you.
Beginning in 1618, the 30 Years' War claimed the lives of at least 5 million people. It was a true European apocalypse. Today, we are sitting on a doomsday machine. Our challenge is to stop it before it destroys mankind, either through a global economic devastation or nuclear war. The solution provided by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 to the atrocities of its time should be an inspiration for us to create a dynamic of peace through change of our way of thinking and our way of doing. Because it not only ended religious wars and established a new form of peace negotiations among states, as you can read in all history books, but more fundamentally, because it addressed agape, the Greek word for understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all men in a secular sense. It is with the same spirit that Martin Luther King was embodied the spirit in his famous political sermon delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Loving our enemies, inspired by Matthew's Gospel. He stressed, far from being the pious instruction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. And then he stressed, a second thing that an individual must do in seeking to love his enemies is to discover the element of good in his enemy. And every time you begin to hate that person and think of hating that person, realize that there is some good there and look at those good points which will overbalance the bad points. And then there is another reason why you should love your enemies, and that is because hate distorts the personality of the hater. What Martin expresses here, in its deepest form, is a principle shared by the best of all civilizations in our human history. When you are committed to improve a person by changing his or her way of thinking and acting, and therefore to improving yourself.
Africa, bogged down and fragmented into zones of influence and vital spaces, is the byproduct of the geopolitics of the Western imperialist powers, structured and organized since the 19th century. These Western geopolitics rely on a fringe of the African elite, baited by individual gain, who serve as a screen for the real masters. This is what's called neo-colonialism, which has never been as vivid as it is today, through a whole series of mechanisms, secret defense agreements justifying the presence of military bases, monetary control such as the franc CFA, leonine trade agreements, the maintenance of outward-oriented economies, odious debts, etc. To the question, what can Africa expect from the rest of the world? Africa expects the West to stop with its ambiguities and hypocrisy. In reality, Western geopolitical traditions have certainly mutated in many respects, but their structure remains the same. The geopolitics of the sea England, United States, Japan, the continental geopolitics, Germany, the geopolitics of the fortress, in Russia, the geopolitics of defeat. France, Italy have undergone an aggiornamento with regard to the different revolutions that have taken place over time, but they need vital spaces in order to continue to maintain positions of power in the concert of nations. For without the double revolution of the atom and the missile, the Russia-Ukraine war would set the whole of Europe ablaze and drag the whole world with it, as the West knows how to do. That is why we reiterate this call for end to Western hypocrisy. The West must abandon geopolitics in order to get rid of harmful power complexes.
And even though we have a different worldview, we're coming at things from a different perspective. I must say that your organization has been a great source of inspiration. I actually wanted to hold this up. I was very, very excited when I got my copy of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche. I was very excited to get my hands on it, but I was a little bit disappointed because when I opened the table of contents, I discovered that I already had owned every book and every text that was reprinted in it. And you can be sure that the experience of the Schiller Institute and of the LaRouche organization and the history of the National Caucus of Labor Committees and the organizing that was done in times past and continues to go on by the Schiller Institute and by the LaRouche organization is definitely a source of inspiration for the work that we are doing. We are definitely learning from so much of the great work that has been done by your organization over the years, and we appreciate the ability to cooperate on things we agree on, like rebuilding the country with infrastructure, like building understanding and international friendship and cooperation with Russia and China, like opposing the drive for war and political repression. And I really am hopeful that despite all the pessimism and despite all the distortions we're currently seeing in U.S. politics, that something optimistic can break through. There are many people in the United States who don't buy what Joe Biden is saying, don't buy the degrowth agenda that speaks in the name of socialism and leftism, and instead would like to challenge the powers that be and fight for economic growth and construction in this age of darkness and pessimism, and look to Eurasia for inspiration. There was a friend of mine who was a German anti-imperialist activist, and he told me about how back in the 1980s, he used to see campaign posters for organizations aligned with Lyndon LaRouche and with the Schiller Institute in Germany. And they would have images of railway and trains across Russia and China going into Europe. And they looked at these posters and they thought, this is crazy science fiction. This is delusional. And now he looked back on that and realizes just how right and how much of a visionary Lyndon LaRouche was. That he really did understand the way the world was moving. In one of his books, I believe it's Earth's Next 50 Years, he talked about the Eurasian future for the planet, and that there was a huge amount of deep understanding of how the world works, of what motivates people, and where the world is going in the writing of Lyndon LaRouche, and there's plenty that can be learned from it. And it's very clear that the reason Lyndon LaRouche was put in jail was not for any crime he committed, but because he stood up to the forces of destruction and pessimism. And that's why he was put in prison. Exonerating Lyndon LaRouche and making clear he was not guilty of the crimes of which he was convicted is something that should happen.
The United States Department of Agriculture has inscribed in stone above the main portico of the building, built in, the USDA was formed in the 1860s under President Lincoln. But inscribed in stone is the quote, "The husbandman that laboreth must be the first partaker of the fruits," St. Paul. Well, just the opposite today is occurring. The husbandman, the farmer, the steward of the land is the last to receive any kind of return from the fruits of his labor. And in fact, is being put out of business by this cartel-controlled food system. The monopoly is extracting the wealth from this enterprise called agriculture, leaving poverty behind, hungry people, bad food, highly processed foods, and deepening the world's crisis of hunger and lack of food. 4 big meat packers are crushing small ranchers. The JBS cyber attack was only a hiccup in the meat packing operations, but for legislators, the security scare was a sign that it might be time to break up the industry. Again, much like the COVID problem and the breakdown of the supply chain, we are looking to build better, more resilient, safer food systems that lift people from poverty, not only in agriculture, but people who eat as well. Monopolies are bad. It's been written about by several authors, and Barry Lynn says, fight what's bad while building something better. So let's build something better. What will that look like? Abraham Lincoln and his advisor, Henry Carey, said, we must adopt measures needed for bringing together the producers and consumers of food and wool, and thus augmenting their power to have commerce among themselves.
Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech called The Four Freedoms. And in that speech, he talked about freedom from want. He gave this speech because he wanted to correct what he knew was already a problem. This was during the course of the war. And of course, that war would take, depending on who you listen to, between 60 million and 100 million people, depending on how you count it. 27 million people in the Soviet Union alone. But he recognized that the war was actually caused by the imperial systems that had existed, whether we're talking about Portugal, France, Britain, and he wanted to eliminate this. This was, of course, a big source of his fight with Churchill. Well, he didn't live to do that. But this idea of freedom from want as a central component of what he called the four freedoms is the last of the freedoms to be ever invoked or brought up whenever you're hearing about any of these conferences about human rights. The United States, Britain, various other countries love to do conferences about human rights, but they never talk about the four freedoms and the notion of freedom from want as being, as Roosevelt had defined it, essential to preventing the outbreak of another world war. So I would submit that I agree, first of all, with what the premise is that the questioner puts forward, but I would also submit that it was precisely the rejection of Roosevelt's idea about what the post-World War world was going to be, and the triumph, unfortunately, at least temporarily, of the British and other imperial views, including the co-optation of the United States against that outlook. And I think that what we have to do is to fight to overturn that unfortunate turn of events.
Compare the coverage about Ukraine, as horrible the situation there is, compare that to the coverage about Afghanistan, where basically more than 50% of the people were, and still many of those are in mortal danger. So at that point, I called for Operation Ibn Sina. The idea of it was to first try to alarm the world population that there must be an immediate humanitarian aid. In the meantime, many international organizations are there, but that more importantly, you had to build up the economy, to build infrastructure, to build agriculture, industry, to stop the poppy opium production. And, you know, in the meantime, a lot has been done. The Taliban, not to our surprise, but to the surprise of many, banned all poppy production, banning opium production. But, you know, obviously the country is still in utter need. So I called for Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina is one of the great physicians of all of mankind. He wrote first of all, he lived from 980 to 1037, about 1,000 years ago. He was one of the absolute great physicians of all of mankind. He wrote a canon of medicine, which was the standard medical book even in Europe until the 17th, 18th century. Then he was also, he discovered the importance of quarantine to fight epidemics, which obviously was extremely important in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, so I called the effort to save Afghanistan Operation Ibn Sina.
Really, if the world is serious about mitigating climate change, and therefore they would not be selective in the technologies that are available and are suited for that, to achieve that. And therefore, really, it makes me question the agenda in this whole climate change thing, to say, is it really honest? Are we really having honest and scientific discussions when it comes to mitigating climate change? Or it's really one of those global agendas of dominance? So yeah, that's just my take to it, to say, if you want a clean air, or if you want a world where climate change is mitigated, therefore you would include nuclear as part of the energy mix, and especially if really the development or our economies matter. Because at the end of the day, what I have seen happening is that we sort of have people who are more focused on mitigating climate change while they are neglecting developmental issues, which I find as hypocrisy. And that's just my take in it. And then I also saw a comment about African leaders being corrupt. It's on the chart. So I just want to also touch on that, to say corruption does not come dressed in race. Anyone can be corrupt anywhere else in the world. And secondly, the commentary says, so African government cannot handle nuclear. We have nuclear power plants in South Africa. We have been involved in nuclear developments in Africa since 1965. And South Africa is also an African country. Egypt is about to build the nuclear power plant. So therefore, if these countries are able to handle nuclear power plants, any country anywhere else in Africa can be able to also achieve that.
Well, I think what we are trying to do is we try to create a world movement of people who, fight against the danger of nuclear war, who fight for a new paradigm. And obviously, when you are trying to, put together a movement all over the world, you cannot expect that you come together sort of for the first time and everybody is in total agreement. And, if you agree on the most basic questions, which is, that we absolutely cannot have a nuclear war and that we need a new paradigm because the old institutions are failing, then that is a good beginning. And if there are other questions which are not so clear or people have different views, well, that's not a problem because, I think we are all in a process of hopefully learning, of self-perfection. Dennis just said, that you can undo your axioms. I think this is very important because, how comes that people react to the same event in so different ways? How does it come that people have different interpretation of the same thing, what they jointly experience? It has to do with the axioms and theorems, because the axioms determine what you think and how you look at a certain thing.